Hello, and a warm welcome back. In part 2 of this 7-part series, we examine the issue of casual sex and consent in our society. The current debate about the legal status of sex work per se is a throwback to a debate that has not been much enacted since the 1950s and the early 1960s. In that era, in political theory and in law, it was all the rage in the Anglo-American world to debate whether activities such as sex work and anal sex among gays should be legally tolerated. And doesn't the current debate over Bill C-36 feel like a time warp that takes us back to that era? In one sense, this makes it easier to conduct the debate now, because we can simply go back and dust off the seminal sources from that era and read their conclusions back into the record. In a later segment, we'll do precisely that. However, we also need to update our view of sex work and of the broader social context for attitudes concerning sex, because these have changed a great deal in a half-century. So we begin that journey in this segment. But first, a couple of pieces of housekeeping. A note about screen resolution. Note that this video supports 720 high definition, which you might want to select via the little star in the bottom right-hand corner of the YouTube video frame, so that you can read details on some of the slides, such as footnotes that have smaller type. Second, if you watched part 1, thanks a lot. I see that we're now up to 10 views, which would be great, except that I think that about 9 of them were mine. This was my first podcast ever, so I've been checking back to see if anyone has taken an interest. So if you were the other person, other than myself, who watched, thanks a lot. Is that what they mean by going viral? There is not one, but rather there are several overlapping contexts for examining contemporary paid sexual services. One obviously relevant context is provided by attitudes that prevail to casual sex itself, along with the combination of the sociological, economic, structural, and technological roots of those attitudes. That's our focus in this part. We'll also deal with the issues of consent and, very briefly, of emerging scientific knowledge concerning the health implications of sex. Let's start with a definition. I think of casual sex as sexual relations involving partners who have not reached, or not yet reached, an agreement to be exclusively or forever involved with one another. As such, paid sexual services, as a formal and legal category, are clearly a subcategory of casual sex, one that is characterized, obviously, by the additional aspect of money changing hands. The sexual revolution featured the progressive acceptance of a much larger range of social forms of sexuality and a public embrace of the erotic. In retrospect, there were multiple key origins. There was the availability from June 1960 of oral contraceptives. In terms of urban geography, there was the rapid growth of rental apartment stock in large centers, often consisting disproportionately of small bachelor one-bedroom units, and which provided the setting for single social life. And culturally, there was the decline of public hierarchical sources of moral authority. With the fading into memory of the Second World War and later the quagmire in Vietnam, there was an undermining of the legitimacy and the power of the conservative stiffs in suits. And so you had countercultural movements such as the beatniks in the 1950s, and then in the Vietnam era, the hippies from the late 1960s. In North America, such folks put their shoulders to the wheel of the new social movements. flowing out of that decade, and as prime exemplars of those movements, you had the women's liberation and the gay rights movements, in addition to the civil rights movement of the United States. And if we want to begin to understand or recall the meaning of those changes for those who lived them, we can reread period pieces from the popular culture of the day, such as Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl from 1962. Brown's work was published in 28 countries, and it stayed on the bestseller list for over a year. If we crib the analysis of Eric Klinenberg in his excellent recent book, Going Solo, we understand that Brown's book envisioned broadened horizons for women. She imagined a greater sense of personal autonomy and freedom, and giving proper weight to having an active and satisfying sex life in organizing one's life. Brown also endorsed the benefits for women of postponing marriage. More broadly, the sexual revolution positioned sex as the private, personal property of individuals. It was now no longer primarily a socially controlled asset. As Esther Perel notes, calling on the work of Anthony Giddens, sexuality became, quote, a property of the self, one that we develop, define, and renegotiate throughout our lives. The sexual revolution was not promulgated solely by mere cultural changes. As we've seen, it dovetailed with and was concretely expressed by contemporaneous changes in how urban space was planned and occupied. As Klinenberg notes, quote, during the 1960s and 70s, the housing market aided the search for autonomy. In most big cities, middle-class individuals could easily find affordable rental units, and as they clustered together in places of their own, they forged neighborhood cultures organized around single life. There are today unparalleled numbers of individuals living alone, and they're pursuing goals, meanings, and purposes that are well supported by such arrangements. And so most of us now embrace living alone ourselves or accept those who make that choice. So common are these arrangements today that few of us will even recall the changes in attitudes that coincided with these changing facts on the ground. As Klinenberg notes, quote, in a survey of Americans conducted in 1957, more than half the respondents said that unmarried people were, quote, sick, immoral, or neurotic, end quotes, while about a third of them viewed them neutrally. These positions did not hold. By 1976, a generation later, only 1/3 of Americans acknowledged that they had negative views about the unmarried, while half were neutral, and 1 in 7 actually approved. This has very much been a broad-based change across numerous Western countries, including Canada. Here, in data provided by Statistics Canada, we see in the upper left-hand chart in the first bar cluster the rapid and monotonic growth of households in Canada that are composed of just one person. In the upper right-hand chart, we see in the top royal blue line that this is not uniquely a phenomena of the elderly, but rather we see a relatively consistent proportion from age 25 through late middle age of approximately 10 to 15% of the population living alone. In aggregate, this of course represents many millions of Canadians. The flip side of this trend for the younger cohorts is the clear evidence that in Canada, as in other Western countries, the proportion of people living in married or common law partnerships rapidly declined during a 30-year period through 2011. So what does all of this have to do with casual sex? Well, We need to recognize that casual sex is proliferating in parallel with changes in how we live, and also with the transition to a fluid post-industrial economy. Postponing marriage, living alone, and having casual sexual partners are to some degree about a desire and to some degree a need to keep one's options open. If there's one word to describe the requirement of modern economic life in the post-industrial economy, it is agility. In the industrial economy, life is simple, life is steady. You get up in the morning, put on your steel-toed boots, and report to the factory. Later, the buzzer sounds, and you go home to your family, and the rhythm continues year in, year out. The post-industrial economy, by contrast, is not so much about manipulating physical objects, pumping out widgets. It's about manipulating symbols, whether those be computer code, digital advertising strategies, financial engineering, etc. And in this phase of development, work groups are convened and they are dissolved, often rapidly. In the old days, a factory was built that cost perhaps hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars that could only be amortized over a useful life of decades of steady operations. Now, post-industrial work is increasingly organized as freelancers and consultants, fungible contract resources, producing content, writing code, working on projects that may last a few weeks or a few months. We come together, we produce, often working from our own spaces in relative isolation. We separate, and we roam to new projects. Globalization has brought global competition, and those of us who seek to lead and compete in this market, particularly those who create new technologies and undertake projects, sometimes have periods that mirror the famous eat, sleep, and swim nouveau monastic ethic of U.S. Olympic swimmer Michael Phelps circa 2008. This agile mode of working rewards those who are flexible and able to find the passionate personal engagement with projects to switch on and sustain the afterburners. It's not all necessarily logically incompatible with marriage or stable monogamous relationships, but it does alter the incentives by making routine, fixed time commitments more costly and a source of dissonance in daily life. As Anne Swidler has noted, quoted by Elizabeth Bernstein in Temporarily Yours, the need to be continually ready for new demands creates an eagerness to keep the self free and unconstrained. And as Bernstein continues, quote, whether in the public sphere of work, in the private sphere of the family, or in the embodied sphere of desire, the postmodern individual tends toward ever-increasing autonomy and mobility, unfettered by any form of binding or permanent social ties. Let me also add that the post-industrial economy involves interesting work, makes high cognitive demands, emphasizes creativity and innovation, and rewards taking ground as swiftly as possible, with opportunities to reap large financial gains. Subjectively, for those of us who've had our children or are childless, within this frame of reference, it will not be obvious to everyone that their highest calling in life is necessarily and at all times bound up with selecting furniture, barbecuing steaks, applying fertilizer as half of a domestic suburban partnership, for example. Some of us want or need to have much more control than all that over the goals to which we devote ourselves, given our very limited time in this life. The good news is that in a plural society, we don't need to agree on these preferences. One individual's choices in the community can complement those of others, just so long as we maintain in our political system a healthy respect for individuals' prerogatives to lead different lives from our own, and allow individuals the freedom to design and negotiate their lives with others. The postponement of marriage is intertwined with the modern hookup culture prevalent among the younger generation. Some of the same characteristics of the post-industrial economy can also be seen writ large in the early stages of contemporary middle-class life. The periods in university, and when people are establishing their careers, can also feature discontinuities around where people live and their expectations for their prospects in life. This is a period that also rewards flexibility and focus in adapting to changing circumstances. And so, in terms of people's sexuality, both young men and women are pursuing lives in which, as Rosen puts it, they can have, quote, sexual adventure without commitment, where they can enter into temporary relationships that don't derail their careers. While casual sex is gradually gaining acceptance in many people's lives, it would be a gross exaggeration to say that these patterns have diffused evenly throughout society. In a U.S. study, only 43% of men aged 40 to 69 without a domestic partner said that they'd had intercourse once a week or more during the previous 6 months. 49% of divorced single men said that they had sex, quote, not at all, end quote, during the previous 6 months. If you believe, as I do, that sex is important for a healthy life, the statistics here convey a poignant story. I think they reveal a great degree of quiet suffering and frustration in the social world that surrounds us, and of a sort that is not at all dispensed with by a cold shower or with a dose of porn and the flickering of a computer screen. And there is nothing even remotely illegitimate ethically about setting these facts as a reasonable concern in the current debate, even though it's not the emphasis I've chosen for this particular series of presentations. On a much happier note, one of the most unambiguously positive developments in recent memory is the control that women have asserted over their own bodies. The crime of rape has greatly declined in frequency in Western societies, and culturally, we've come to accept that no means no in every context without exception. For example, legally, marital rape was criminalized in numerous Western and Asian countries in the 3 decades following 1980, at the same time as traditional religious teachings fell away concerning the obligation to have sex within marriage. And so, with these gains in hand, the conversation has begun to shift, however cautiously. Destigmatizing casual sex, and indeed sex work, has become an important feminist agenda. For women's ownership of their own bodies, beyond demanding respect for no means no, also implies yes means yes. That phrase, yes means yes, supplied the title of a recent collection of essays grappling with all manner of issues of consent. The book was subtitled, quote, Visions of Female Sexual Power and a World Without Rape. And what the contents of this interesting work reveal is that modern feminists battle still the scourge of rape, but they also emphasize a woman's right to say yes. One important essay in this collection is entitled Offensive Feminism, and it poses the question of how feminists can fight back. The author argues, and I quote, "We must emphasize a pleasure-affirming vision of female sexuality, wherein saying yes and no are equally valid moral decisions in many sexual contexts, and wherein women are not only answering the question, but also feel equally entitled to ask for and initiate sex when they want it and their partner agrees. In another essay, its author emphasizes a concern, quote, to be wild and still maintain my bodily autonomy. The pattern we see in these writings is an increasingly open celebration of liberated, autonomous female sexuality. Feminists continue to elaborate and emphasize the importance of the social scripts for negotiating meaningful consent. The same work contains a fascinating discussion among 3 sex workers concerning issues of consent and control. One of the most interesting comments is offered by a woman named Sandra, in which she contrasts the relative high degree of control that she has now working in the sex industry in setting boundaries for sex, with a comparative lack thereof and the negative experiences she had with men before she entered the industry. So meaningful consent remains the critical issue for casual sex across the board, and it's by no means restricted in its focus to the world of sex work. We'll conclude this discussion of meaningful consent in the sex lives of women by quoting at some length the comment of Susan, one of the participants in the discussion. Those who have never met a sex worker might be startled to learn that many of these extremely articulate women emphatically see themselves as exercising control over their sexuality in a manner that is often denied to women who are not sex workers in our society. Susan comments, quote, "We are raised to keep our legs closed, not to be too sexual, to reserve the prize only for those we love. We are discouraged from exploring sexuality and punished when we do anyway. We are called sluts, whores, and various other derogatory names, none of which have a counterpart for men. We are shamed for our sexuality, and sex in general is considered dirty unless it takes place in a heteronormative, monogamous marriage." Women who enter the sexual professions sometimes find refuge there. They discover a world in which everything they'd been discouraged from doing in terms of their sexuality can be explored and rewarded. Prostitution gives women interested in exploring sex with strangers the opportunity to do so. In this segment, we've examined the sociological, structural, and cultural shifts that have all greatly changed the context for sex, and specifically casual sex, in the modern Western world. We would be remiss without briefly touching on recent developments in scientific knowledge. Science powerfully reinforces the view that sex, and particularly sexual intercourse, contributes a great deal to our health and well-being. A recent systematic review of peer-reviewed literature undertaken by Stuart Brody in a meta-analysis published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine in 2010 found strong associations for a wide range of physical and mental health benefits with heterosexual sex. He found that in terms of life expectancy, research in aggregate showed that men having intercourse twice weekly or more have half the death rate of men having sex less than monthly. In terms of cardiovascular health, the frequency of intercourse was associated with, quote, markedly less, quote, blood pressure increases in response to stressors, and also with faster recovery from stressors. Unfortunately, and this is a theme that we see in several of these results, masturbation frequency had a negative effect in contrast to sexual intercourse. With prostate disease, which, as you would know, is one of the principal cancers that afflicts men, intercourse was linked to fewer disorders of the prostate. With prostate function, including elimination of waste products, demonstrably better with intercourse versus masturbation. In terms of mental health, frequency of intercourse was a significant predictor of individual satisfaction with mental health, whereas masturbation frequency is associated with increased depression. Frequency of intercourse was positively associated with emotional integration. And one additional piece of good news for heterosexuals is that there is an extremely low risk of HIV transmission through vaginal intercourse for healthy persons of reproductive age. And that's a quote. Unfortunately, anal intercourse remains a highly effective, that is, readily lethal mechanism of transmission. As a brief aside, granting that there are health benefits to intercourse, why should these be so much stronger than for masturbation? The theory, and it's not at all an implausible one, is that evolutionary pressures are involved. Brody notes that human sight has evolved the capacity to differentiate 1 million different colors, and by the same token, you'd think that evolution would also have imprinted ways to reward us for having orgasms through acts that, in principle, can propagate our genes. In any case, the evidence of the benefits of sex to human well-being is so strong that even lumbering and bureaucratic bodies such as the World Health Organization have issued absolutely clear and bold statements on the subject. The WHO states, and I quote, "Sexual health requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. For sexual health to be attained and maintained, the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled." To wrap up this segment, let us conclude that contemporary sexual mores are written in how we now live and work with greater autonomy in the urban, increasingly post-industrial world. As women's status has grown, women have acquired the absolute moral and legal right to say no to sex, and also to say yes. A Western culture has emerged that is overwhelmingly sex positive, and we've become aware of the substantial health benefits of sex. Now that we understand the deep structural roots of these interrelated developments, it doesn't seem at all a stretch to assert that any project to roll back social patterns to an age of putative abstinence and chastity for singles, to put the genie back into the bottle, as it were, has very little prospect of success. With that thought, I'll close this segment. I appreciate your walking through this with me, and I'll look forward to seeing you in part 3.